Thank you, Mr Chair. And I want to begin by thanking the Honourable Member for the Isle of Wight for bringing this debate forward. And whilst the sentiments behind the Levelling Up Fund are laudable at first glance, it has a profound and far-reaching effect on the devolution settlements and the democratically elected governments of each of the devolved nations. Now, alongside the UK Shared Prosperity Fund also breaching the devolution settlements and UK Government promises, the way the Levelling Up Fund is to be administered encroaches on devolved areas in unconstitutional and unacceptable ways. Now, it's all very well for the UK Government, as it has done, to huff and puff and protest that the devolved nations should shut up and be grateful for the boundless munificence of the paternalistic UK Government. But funding should not be tied to riding a coach and horses through the democratically elected governments of these nations, nor should it be tied to, nor designed to, undermine the democratically established parliaments in each of these nations. For the UK Government, of course, to reject that analysis plays to the agenda, not of levelling up, but exerting undue power and influence over democratic institutions, the very existence of which is due to the democratic support for them. These parliaments in Wales and Scotland were designed to, in part at least, address the democratic deficit that has existed between these nations and Westminster governments. How does attempting to circumvent, undermine and emasculate these institutions address that democratic deficit? Now, yesterday, the local government minister gave the game away because he accepted that there is no formal requirement for local authorities to work with the Scottish Government on devolved policy areas, and that this Levelling Up Fund was, and I quote, about local authorities and communities working directly with the UK Government. Now, given that this work goes to the heart of devolved powers, that is quite an admission. The idea that each different local authority will submit bids for much-needed funds does not in any way negate the cynicism and political opportunism in the way this fund is being distributed, as the Honourable Member for Kilmarnock and Loudon indicated. This is piecemeal stuff with no strategic thinking whatsoever. The fact that the Scottish Government expected £400 million in consequentials from this fund, which is now to be that is now to be decided by the UK Government sitting in Whitehall, how that money will be deployed across local authorities is a nonsense, and it's offensive. There will be no opportunity for a regionalised Scotland-wide approach. The competitive nature of this process will set authority against authority, whilst we know that the most effective way of boosting local economies requires collaborative working. Why does the Minister believe that ministers and civil servants in Whitehall, with little or no detailed knowledge of Scotland or her local authority areas, are equipped to judge between the merits of competing bids? If Levelling Up was truly the agenda, why would you not build in the strategic expertise of the Scottish Government and local MSPs into that process? The fact is that funding should be allocated by formula instead of competitive bidding, which would improve greater transparency and guarantee support for those places most in need, as pointed out by the Honourable Member for Plaid Cymru. As it stands, bids will be at the mercy of the whims of this Tory Government and which local authorities are able to submit the best bid, not the local authorities most in need. And given the Towns Fund, will the bids be judged according to which are considered to be the best, whatever that means? Who knows? There is every reason to fear, Mr Chair, that the bids may be subject to the same pork barrel politics we have seen in all its glory in the Towns Fund. Now, the Public Accounts Committee, despite the fact that the Tories have a majority on that committee, despite that, the Public Accounts Committee delivered a damning verdict on the Tory Towns Fund. And it said, and I quote, the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government had not been open about the process it followed and would not disclose the reasoning for selecting or excluding towns for funding. Now, despite the Government's refusal to even acknowledge this and other damning verdicts and concerns about the Tory Towns Fund, we are now expected to believe, and better still, we're expected to trust, that this Levelling Up Fund will be shiny, new and bright, and we need not worry about transparency because, as the local government minister said in the chamber yesterday, And I quote, "The answer to that is that it's all been published on gov.uk and has been for months now." Well, Mr Chair, if it's published on a website, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly reassured. The fact is that this government has shown it cannot be trusted to deliver this funding in a transparent way, and it has been deliberately designed to undermine the devolved parliaments. The good people of Scotland and Wales are not so easily fooled as this Tory government seems to think, which is why they repeatedly reject Tory governments at every opportunity. Since the Brexit vote itself has taken place, this government has taken to itself the power to take decisions on spending on economic development, infrastructure, culture, sporting activities, domestic educational and training activities and educational exchanges. And this fund will further allow the UK government to bypass devolved decision making and override democratic process for allocating spending in Scotland. This means that more than £100 million a year could be spent in areas that are normally devolved to the Scottish Parliament. In this government's ham-fisted attempt to undermine devolution, it is in fact cementing support for independence in Scotland. If devolution is indeed the opportunity to do things differently, that opportunity is being eroded bit by this government, which seems desperate to govern devolved areas in Scotland. And they could, Mr Chair, they could govern devolved areas in Scotland if only they could win an election in Scotland. Having given up on that, we see now an agenda to undermine the very institutions that the people of Scotland will not vote to permit them to control the Scottish Parliament. And of course, Mr Chair, every local authority will wish to bid for levelling up funding. Why on earth would they not? But the Towns Fund shows that we are wise to be concerned about the transparency of this process, and we know the real agenda in the devolved nations is cynical, to say the least. Any local authority in Scotland and Wales receiving money from this fund will be expected to doff their caps in gratitude for the munificence and benevolence of the UK government. But the UK government needs to understand that riding roughshod over our democratic institutions, which have huge support from those living in the devolved nations, cannot be excused by fanfare about funding that is not new. We are not so easily bought, and our democratic institutions, our Scottish Parliament, cannot be so easily bought. Nor can trust in this government be bought. Some things, Mr Chair, like democracy and trust, are not commodities. They are values and they are principles. And this government would do well to remember that.